What if the part of your life that feels like it is falling apart is actually the first sign that your next chapter can no longer be built on the old story your ego created? Most people imagine a new season begins with something beautiful and obvious. A phone call, a promotion, a person returning, a door opening, a sudden answer that makes all the waiting feel worthwhile. But very often, before the best chapter of your life begins, something else happens first. A plan stops working. A relationship loses its familiar shape. A dream you were clinging to becomes strangely heavy. A door you kept pushing refuses to open. And because the ego sees only the surface, it calls this failure. It says life is moving backward. It says you are being delayed, forgotten, or quietly rejected. But in the deeper language of the psyche, and in the spiritual language of divine timing, a broken plan is not always the end of the future. Sometimes it is the end of a false agreement you made with yourself long ago. You may have promised yourself that if you became successful enough, no one could dismiss you. You may have believed that if you stayed useful enough, people would keep choosing you. You may have built an entire identity around being strong, composed, capable, dependable, and impressive, while the truest part of you stood quietly behind that image, waiting for permission to breathe. Jung would not only ask what you lost, he would ask who in you was trying so hard to keep it. Was it the self, the deeper center of your being, moving toward truth? Or was it the ego, trying to protect an old wound by building a life that looked safe from the outside, but felt increasingly narrow within? This question matters because not every closed door is against you. Some doors close because the room behind them is too small for the person you are becoming. Some delays stretch longer than you wanted because capacity has not yet caught up with desire. Some disappointments arrive not to punish you, but to interrupt the version of you that was willing to abandon peace for proof. This does not mean pain is easy. It does not mean every loss should be called beautiful too quickly. There are seasons that feel confusing, unfair, and exhausting, especially when you did everything you knew how to do and still watched the result move away from you. But what if the deeper movement has already begun beneath what you can see? What if the old story is being loosened before the new chapter can appear? What if the life that seems delayed is actually being rearranged so that your future does not have to be carried by the same fear, the same persona, the same hunger to prove yourself? Sometimes life begins working out long before it feels good. Sometimes the first mercy is not an open door, but the collapse of the wrong one. And the deeper question is not why this is happening to you, but what part of you is finally being freed because it happened. The hardest delay is the one that gives you no clear explanation. You keep doing what seems responsible. You answer the emails, make the calls, apply for the opportunity, pray for direction, show up with as much steadiness as you can, and still the result does not come. From the outside, nothing looks dramatic enough for people to understand why you are so tired. There is no single event you can point to and say, this is where everything changed. There is only a season that stretches longer than you expected, a closed space between who you were and who you are not yet ready to become. And in that space, the ego begins to panic because the ego measures life by visible movement. If the invitation has not arrived, the ego says nothing is happening. If the relationship has not become clear, the ego says you are losing. If the recognition has not come, the ego says your effort has been wasted. But the deeper self does not measure progress only by speed. It measures whether you have the capacity to carry what you keep asking life to give you. This is where delay can become more mysterious than punishment. Sometimes what is holding you back is also making you larger inside. It is teaching your nervous system not to chase every sign of approval. It is teaching you to survive uncertainty without collapsing into desperation. It is teaching you discernment so that you do not mistake every open door for a divine door. It is teaching you boundaries so that the next chapter does not become another place where you lose yourself in order to be accepted. If a breakthrough arrives before these things are formed, the ego may use it as proof instead of receiving it as purpose. A person can get the job and still remain terrified of being replaceable. A person can enter the relationship and still abandon themselves to keep it. A person can receive the applause and still feel hollow when the room becomes quiet. This is why not every delay is against your future. Some delays are protecting your future from being carried by the same old fear. Jung might say that the psyche refuses to give more power to a personality structure that has not yet become whole. The ego wants the next thing because it believes the next thing will finally make it feel safe. But the self asks a different question. Who will you be when you receive it? Will you still need it to prove your worth? Will you still sacrifice your peace to keep it? Will you still call exhaustion dedication because the world praises you for being capable? In the language of faith, this is often how God forms capacity before he opens the door. He does not only prepare the opportunity, he prepares the person who will walk through it. And preparation often feels slow because it is working in places applause cannot reach. Your patience, your motives, your boundaries, your courage to disappoint people, your ability to choose truth over performance. So if something has not opened yet, it may not mean you are being denied. It may mean the part of you that would have been consumed by it is being strengthened first. The waiting is not empty just because it is uncomfortable. The silence is not useless just because it does not explain itself. Something in you may be learning how to stand without the old proof, so that when the next chapter begins, you do not enter it as the same person who once needed success to feel real. Laura Bennett had built her life around the art of making things look beautiful before anyone noticed how much pressure it took to hold them together. At 41, in Nashville, Tennessee, she had become the kind of event planner people trusted when the room had to feel effortless. Weddings under warm string lights, corporate retreats in polished hotel ballrooms, charity dinners with white flowers, soft music, perfect timing, and speeches that began exactly when they were supposed to begin. Laura knew how to walk into chaos and make it appear graceful. She could calm a nervous bride, redirect a difficult client, fix a seating problem, adjust the lighting, replace a missing centerpiece, and still smile as if nothing had ever been close to falling apart. People admired that about her. They called her gifted, composed, unshakable. But what they admired was also the role that had slowly begun to drain the life from her. In Jungian language, this was persona at its most elegant. The social face had become so polished that even Laura had trouble knowing where the performance ended and the person began. She was the woman who made everything work. The woman who anticipated needs before they were spoken. The woman who could turn other people's important moments into something unforgettable. But in the quiet after each event, when the flowers were being thrown away, the chairs were stacked, the lights were turned off, and she drove home through the dark streets of Nashville with makeup fading and her feet aching, she often felt a strange emptiness pressing against her chest. Not sadness exactly. Not even burnout in the ordinary sense. It was more like the self quietly asking why all this beauty left her feeling less alive. Laura told herself the answer was simple. She needed a bigger project, a more important client, a breakthrough that would prove she had not spent years arranging other people's celebrations while her own life stood still. Then came the opportunity she believed would change everything. A large luxury wellness retreat outside Franklin, a high-budget event that could help her finally launch her own planning company. She imagined the website, the testimonials, the photos, the recognition, the clean story she could tell people when they asked where her life was going. For weeks, she poured herself into it. Floor plans, vendor calls, floral concepts, transportation schedules, menus, lighting, designs, backup plans layered beneath backup plans. It looked like ambition, but beneath it was something more fragile, a desperate need for proof. Then, 3 weeks before the contract was supposed to be signed, the client canceled the entire retreat. No dramatic argument, no clear villain, just a change in direction, a polite email, and a sentence about postponing indefinitely. Laura sat at her kitchen table staring at the screen, surrounded by printed timelines and color swatches, and felt the old story collapse in a single quiet moment. The ego called it failure, but the deeper self asked a question she was not ready to answer. Were you building a future, or were you building another beautiful room where your fear could hide? The cancellation did not stay in one place. It moved through Laura's life like a quiet question that followed her into every room. At first, she told herself she only needed to recover the lost project, find another client, replace the contract, and restore the version of the future she had already imagined. But the more she tried to force another opportunity into the empty space, the more something inside her resisted. A week later, she applied for a creative director position with a boutique event company in Nashville, a role that looked like the perfect solution from the outside. It had the title, the visibility, the salary increase, the kind of authority that would make people understand she was not falling behind. She prepared carefully for the interview, wearing a navy dress, carrying a leather portfolio, speaking with the calm confidence she had mastered over years of managing rooms full of expectations. The interview went well enough to let her hope. For several days, she imagined that maybe this was the redirection, maybe the retreat had fallen through, so this door could open instead. Then the email came. They had chosen another candidate. The words were polite, professional, and brief. Laura read them twice, then sat very still at her kitchen table, the same table where the retreat plans had once been spread like a map of rescue. Her ego felt humiliated. It said, another door closed. Another sign that you are losing your place. Another reminder that the chapter you wanted may not be coming. But a closed door does not always carry the meaning the wounded ego assigns to it. Sometimes the deeper question is not why was I rejected, but why did I need this door to open so badly? Was it calling, or was it proof? Was it the self moving toward a truer life, or the persona trying to regain its shine after being disappointed? Jung would ask Laura to look not only at the outer event, but at the inner attachment. The pain was not only that she did not get the position. The pain was that the position had become a mirror in which she hoped to see herself restored. If they chose her, she could believe she was still powerful. If the title came, she could believe the canceled retreat had not exposed anything. If the salary arrived, she could quiet the fear that her life was becoming smaller. But guidance often begins exactly where proof fails. In the language of faith, God may close a door not because the person behind it is unworthy, but because that door would have kept them loyal to the wrong hunger. Laura did not know that yet. She only knew that the old strategies were no longer giving her peace. The more she chased visible confirmation, the more fragile she felt. The more she tried to rebuild the same image, the more the image seemed to lose its authority. That evening, she drove through Nashville without a destination, past restaurants filled with warm light, past music spilling softly from open doorways, past streets where other people seemed to know exactly where they were going. Yet beneath her disappointment, a strange clarity began to form. Maybe the closed door was not asking her to try harder. Maybe it was asking her to tell the truth about what she had been trying to prove. And once that question entered her, the next layer could no longer stay hidden. The next layer did not appear as wisdom at first. It appeared as emotions Laura had spent years trying to be too graceful to admit. Jealousy rose when she saw an old colleague announce a major destination wedding project on social media. Resentment tightened in her chest when a younger planner was praised in a magazine feature for being visionary and fresh. Shame followed her into small conversations when someone asked how business was going, and she heard herself say, I am taking a little time to reassess, even though what she really meant was, I do not know who I am if I am not succeeding in a way people can see. Then came the desire to prove. It was sharp, familiar, and almost energizing. She wanted to build something quickly, post something impressive, accept any client who could make her look busy, and return to the world with evidence that nothing had truly shaken her. This is how the shadow often rises when life refuses to follow the ego's plan. Jung did not see the shadow as evil in the simple way people sometimes imagine it. The shadow contains what the persona has not allowed into the light. For Laura, the persona was composed, generous, capable, tasteful, emotionally polished, and always in control. So where did her anger go? Where did her envy go? Where did her fear of being ordinary go? Where did her exhaustion, her longing, her hunger to be chosen, and her resentment at always making other people's important moments beautiful go? They went into the shadow. And when the retreat collapsed and the job did not come, those hidden feelings began knocking from underneath. At first, Laura judged herself for them. She thought a spiritual person should be above jealousy. A mature woman should not feel threatened by someone else's success. A good person should not resent clients, colleagues, or friends whose lives were moving forward. But this judgment only pushed the shadow deeper. It did not heal it. It only made it more powerful from the dark. The turning point came one night in her apartment after she had spent nearly an hour scrolling through other planners' websites, comparing fonts, photos, venues, and smiling client testimonials until her body felt small and restless. She closed the laptop, sat on the floor beside the couch, and finally said out loud what she had never permitted herself to say. I am tired of making everything look beautiful when when I feel invisible inside it." The sentence did not solve her life, but it told the truth. And truth is the first light the shadow can bear. In the language of faith, this may be one of God's quiet mercies. Not that he removes every uncomfortable feeling, but that he allows what is hidden to become honest enough to be healed. Laura began writing in a notebook each morning. Not affirmations, not polished prayers, honest sentences. "I am jealous because I still think recognition will save me. I am resentful because I gave too much of myself to rooms where I was praised but not known. I am ashamed because I confused being chosen with being valuable." Slowly, the feelings became less frightening because she was no longer pretending they were not there. The shadow did not appear to destroy her. It appeared to return the energy she had trapped in performance. And once she could see what had been driving her, the old map of success began to lose its power. Laura began to understand that the old map had not been useless. It had helped her survive for a long time. It had taught her discipline, taste, timing, responsibility, and the ability to create order where other people felt overwhelmed. But a map that once protected you can become a prison when you keep following it after the landscape has changed. Her old map said, "Be impressive and you will be safe. Be chosen and you will matter. Make everything beautiful and no one will notice how tired you are. Keep the room under control and perhaps your own life will not feel so uncertain." For years, that map had given her direction, but it had also kept her circling the same inner territory. The destination was always just ahead. One more client, one more elegant event, one more public success, one more title that would finally quiet the fear underneath. But after the retreat was canceled, after the creative director position went to someone else, after the shadow began speaking through jealousy, resentment, and exhaustion, Laura could no longer pretend the map was leading her somewhere alive. Jung might say that this is the point where the old orientation of the ego loses authority. The ego does not surrender easily, because it believes the map is reality itself. It says, if you stop striving for this version of success, you will become nothing. If you stop managing how people see you, you will disappear. If you stop being useful in the old way, no one will know what to do with you. But the self does not ask you to disappear. It asks you to stop confusing visibility with existence. It asks you to become real enough that your life is no longer organized around being selected, praised, or understood. In the language of faith, this is where God sometimes removes the compass that only pointed toward approval, so that your soul can finally learn the direction of peace. Laura began with small acts of disobedience to the old map. She declined a last-minute corporate event that would have paid well, but would have required 2 weeks of frantic overextension. She removed photos from her website that represented work she no longer wanted to repeat. She stopped describing her pause as a strategy and began calling it what it was, a season of rebuilding. She did not make these changes with dramatic certainty. Some mornings she still wondered whether she was making a mistake. But the difference was that fear no longer held the pen completely. One afternoon, while sorting old boxes of fabric samples, vendor lists, and event timelines, she realized how much of her life had been arranged around preventing disappointment. She had built backups for backups, solutions for every possible problem, beautiful surfaces for every room, but almost no space for her own truth to enter. She sat on the floor surrounded by old plans and understood that the next chapter could not be reached by improving the old performance. It needed a different compass. Not applause, not urgency, not proof. Alignment, peace, a quieter form of usefulness, a beauty that did not require her to vanish inside it. And once the old map lost its power, the future did not become instantly clear. But the false direction became harder to obey, and sometimes that is the first real sign that a new road has already begun. Living as if the process had already begun did not mean Laura pretended to be certain. It meant she stopped treating uncertainty as permission to betray herself. After the old map lost its authority, her days became smaller, quieter, and more honest than the life she had been trying to force back into motion. She took a part-time role at a small wellness center near East Nashville, helping with scheduling, room setup, and community workshops. It was not glamorous. There were no luxury tablescapes, no high-budget floral installations, no clients expecting perfection under pressure. There were simple chairs, soft lamps, sign-in sheets, teacups, folded blankets, and people arriving tired from ordinary life, hoping to feel less alone for an hour. At first, the ego in Laura wanted to minimize it. This is temporary, she told herself. This is just until something bigger comes along. But the self heard something different in that quiet building. It heard less noise. It heard breath. It heard a kind of work that did not require her to disappear behind beauty. She began waking earlier, not because ambition was chasing her, but because her body no longer felt trapped in constant urgency. She walked through Shelby Park in the mornings, sometimes 2 miles along the path when the air was cool and the trees held the first pale light of day. She stopped checking other planners' social media before breakfast. She cleared old contracts from her desk. She slept with her phone outside the bedroom. She wrote a list titled "What I No Longer Need to Prove," and underneath it she wrote sentences that felt both frightening and freeing. I do not need to prove I am valuable by being exhausted. I do not need to prove I am successful by being seen everywhere. I do not need to prove I am strong by never needing rest. These were not grand achievements, but they were the stones of a new foundation. In Jungian language, she was withdrawing psychic energy from the persona and returning it to the self. In the language of faith, she was cooperating with a process that had started before she could explain it. She also enrolled in a short course on trauma-informed community support, not because she had a perfect plan, but because something about creating safer spaces for people felt alive in a way luxury events no longer did. Slowly, her gift began to change shape. She still knew how to arrange a room, but now she asked different questions. Not how can this look impressive, but how can this feel safe? Not how can people remember the spectacle, but how can they feel held while they are here? This is how a life begins to work out before the outer proof arrives. Not through one dramatic breakthrough, but through small acts of alignment repeated until the inner world becomes ready for a different outer world. Laura still had bills to pay. She still had moments of doubt. She still wondered whether people from her old circles thought she had fallen. But she no longer lived as if their interpretation were the final truth. The process had begun, and she could feel it in the quietest places, the cleaner mornings, the slower breath, the honest no, the peaceful yes, the absence of panic where desperation used to live. And sometimes, before a door opens in the world, the first opening is this. You become someone who no longer needs the wrong door to prove you are worthy. The invitation came on a rainy Thursday afternoon while Laura was arranging chairs in the wellness center's small back room. It was not dramatic enough for the old version of her to call a breakthrough. No one offered her a massive contract. No luxury client appeared with a budget large enough to restore her former image. Instead, the center director stood in the doorway holding a clipboard and asked whether Laura would be willing to design a small monthly series for people moving through grief, transition, and major life change. Nothing extravagant, she said, just a space that feels warm, thoughtful, and safe. Laura looked around the room. Beige walls, a circle of simple chairs, a low table with tea, candles, and folded blankets, a window looking out toward wet pavement and early evening traffic. A year earlier, she might have dismissed this as too small to matter. Her ego would have asked how it could raise her profile, how it could become visible, how it could prove she was still important. But now she felt something different. Not the rush of being seen, but the quiet recognition of being aligned. For years, Laura had used beauty to impress. Now she was being asked to use beauty to hold. That difference changed everything. She began planning the series with a gentleness she had never brought to her former work. She chose soft lighting not to create spectacle, but to help people feel less exposed. She arranged the chairs not around a stage, but in a circle, so no one felt placed above or below anyone else. She selected simple flowers from a local market, not because they would photograph well, but because they brought a little life into a room where people might arrive carrying heavy memories. She prepared the space slowly, asking not, will they admire this, but, will they feel safe enough to breathe here? This was still her gift. The eye for atmosphere, the sense of timing, the ability to notice what a room needed before others named it. But the gift had been purified by loss. It no longer served only the persona. It served the soul. Jung might say that a function once trapped in the service of ego had been returned to the deeper self. In the language of faith, this is how God can redeem what seemed to fall apart. He does not always give you a different talent. Sometimes he gives you a different reason to use the talent you already had. The first evening of the series was quiet. 12 people came. Some sat with hands folded in their laps. Some looked down at their shoes. Some smiled politely because they did not yet know how much of themselves they were allowed to bring into the room. Laura stood near the doorway, not as the impressive planner, not as the woman who could make everything flawless, but as someone who understood that a room can become a kind of mercy when it is created with truth. And as the session began, she felt the strange tenderness of a chapter opening without applause. It was not bigger in the old sense. It was deeper. It did not make her more visible to the world. It made her less divided within herself. And perhaps that is the real sign that a better chapter has begun. Not that everyone finally sees you, but that you no longer have to disappear in order to be valued. 1 year after the retreat was canceled, Laura Bennett could look back and see that the life she had feared losing was not the same life she was meant to keep. Her apartment in Nashville was still modest. Her schedule was still simpler than it had been when she was managing luxury events and racing from vendor calls to venue walkthroughs. She had not become a famous planner. She had not returned to the old circles with a spectacular announcement that forced everyone to admire her. But she was sleeping better. Her mornings no longer began with panic disguised as ambition. Her body no longer felt as if it had to prove its worth before breakfast. She still worked at the wellness center, but the small monthly healing series had grown into something quietly meaningful. Not large, not glamorous, meaningful. People came after long seasons of change, grief, burnout, divorce, caregiving, career loss, and silent transitions that did not fit neatly into ordinary conversation. Laura prepared the room with the same attention she once gave to ballrooms and gala spaces, but the energy was different now. She placed chairs in a circle, warmed the light, set out tea, folded blankets, simple flowers, and small note cards for reflection. She made sure the room did not demand performance from anyone who entered it. And as she moved through those preparations, she often realized that the gift had never been wrong. The distortion had been in why she used it. Before, beauty had been a way to be chosen. Now, beauty became a way to make people feel safe enough to be honest. Before, she arranged rooms so others would praise the result. Now, she arranged rooms so something real could breathe inside them. This is what it means when life begins to work out at a deeper level. It may not return you to the exact dream the ego wanted. It may not rebuild the image you lost. It may not make the people who misunderstood you suddenly understand. But it can take the very abilities that were once trapped inside fear and return them to the service of the self. Jung might say that Laura was no longer identified with the persona of the flawless planner. She could still plan. She could still create atmosphere. She could still organize beauty. But she was no longer owned by the need to appear unshakable. The shadow that had carried her jealousy, resentment, shame, and hunger for recognition had not destroyed her. Once brought into the light, it had given back energy. It had shown her where she was still starving to be validated. It had shown her where she had turned success into medicine for a wound that success could never heal. And in the language of faith, God had not wasted any of it. The canceled retreat, the closed position, the long walks through Shelby Park, the honest notebook pages, the smaller job, the quiet mornings, the first group of 12 people sitting carefully in a circle, all of it had been working together beneath the surface. Not to punish her, not to humiliate her, not to make her life smaller, but to move her out of a life that looked impressive and into one that could finally hold her truth. On a cool evening in early spring, after one of the healing sessions ended, Laura stayed behind to clean the room. Outside, rain tapped gently against the windows, and the parking lot lights shimmered on the wet pavement. The last participant, a woman in her 50s, paused at the doorway and said softly, "I did not know a room could feel this kind." Then she left before Laura could answer. Laura stood there for a moment, holding a stack of note cards in her hands, and felt tears rise without panic behind them. Not because the words were dramatic, but because they reached the exact place in her that had once believed only large, visible success could prove her life was becoming something. A kind room, a safe room, a room where people did not have to perform. This was not the chapter her ego had imagined. It was not the version she had tried to force. It was deeper, quieter, and more truthful. She turned off the lamps one by one, leaving only the soft hallway light. and thought about the old Laura who had sat at her kitchen table staring at the canceled retreat email, certain that something important had been taken from her. If she could speak to that woman now, she would not say, "Do not worry, you will get everything you wanted." She would say, "Something better than proof is being prepared in you. You are being freed from the need to turn your life into evidence. You are being led toward a beauty that does not require you to disappear." Sometimes the best chapter does not begin when everything finally goes your way. Sometimes it begins when the things that went wrong have removed the parts of you that could only live for approval. Sometimes life works out by closing the door that would have kept you impressive but empty. Sometimes the breakthrough is not a louder life, but a truer one. And perhaps this is what you need to remember in your own season of delay. Everything may already be working beneath what you can see, not necessarily to give the ego every outcome it demands, but to return you to the self that can receive what is real without losing itself. The old story may be falling apart because it was too small. The old map may be fading because it could not lead the person you are becoming. The shadow may be rising because it carries the energy you need for healing. The closed door may be protecting the future from being built on fear. And one day, when you stand inside a life that feels quieter than you expected but more honest than anything you could force, you may understand that the chapter did not begin when the world applauded. It began when you stopped abandoning yourself for applause.